Lake Tahoe is terminal. That's a technical way to explain water is not flowing out of the lake. Now, it won't always be like this, but the consequences of an extended drought go beyond the waterline.
Beneath Lake Tahoe, at a depth no swimmer will ever reach, divers came face to face with something that shocked every person connected to the case.
California state parks have developed Tahoe's first underwater trail. It's called the Emerald Bay State Park Maritime Heritage Trail.
It was not treasure, and it was not a monster. It was something stranger, something the coldest water in America had been quietly protecting for 17 years while millions of tourists swam above it. What came up from the dark reopened a case everyone had given up on and proved a legend locals were never supposed to believe. Once you know what it was, you will never see this lake the same way again. A lake apart. To understand why that discovery was even possible, you have to understand what kind of lake this actually is, because Lake Tahoe does not behave like other lakes. It never has. Tahoe sits at 6,225 feet of elevation, straddling the border between California and Nevada. It is the largest alpine lake in North America, and the second deepest lake in the United States, plunging 1,645 feet at its deepest point. Only Oregon's Crater Lake goes deeper. The basin was carved by geological faulting millions of years ago, leaving a steep-walled trench that filled with snowmelt so pure that for decades, you could look down through nearly 70 feet of water and still make out the bottom. That clarity exists because almost nothing lives in the open water. The surrounding granite contributes very few nutrients. The cold slows biological activity to a crawl. Tahoe is close to sterile, and that sterility is exactly what draws millions of visitors every single year. But the postcards leave something out. The surface may warm in summer, but the deep water never does. Below a few hundred feet, Tahoe holds steady around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. All year, every year, and near the bottom, it sinks into the mid-30s. Down there it is dark, still, and cold enough to slow decay almost to a stop. Think about what that combination actually means. In a warm, shallow, biologically busy lake, whatever sinks gets broken down, buried, or consumed within a few seasons. In deep Tahoe, whatever sinks tends to stay, and it stays recognizable, sometimes for decades. Wood does not rot the way it should. Metal corrodes slowly. Paint survives. Fabric survives. The lake was not designed as a vault, but it behaves like one, and for most of the 20th century, the people living around it treated it accordingly. Keep that in mind, because it is the only reason something could wait in the dark past Rubicon Point for as long as it did. The post-war rush. Before World War II, Tahoe was hard to reach. The mountain roads were treacherous and often impassable in winter. A handful of lodges catered to wealthy travelers, but the lake stayed mostly wild, the kind of place most Americans had only ever seen in pictures. The war changed everything. Roads improved, soldiers trained in the region, fell in love with it, and came back after the war with cars, money, and vacation time. The boom hit in the late 1940s and accelerated through the 1950s. Casinos rose on the Nevada shore, where gambling was legal. Resorts multiplied. Summer cabins became year-round homes. The transformation moved faster than any oversight could follow, because in that era, meaningful environmental regulation barely existed, and booms generate garbage, construction debris, worn-out equipment, old cars, old boats, old everything. Across America in the 1950s, lakes and rivers were treated as free disposal sites, and Tahoe's shoreline collected its share. Tires went in, engine blocks went in, bottles and cans went in by the thousands. Entire vessels were scuttled when they stopped being useful. Some of it was casual littering by visitors who assumed the lake would swallow the evidence. Some of it was deliberate disposal by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Almost none of it was ever written down. When the environmental movement gained strength in the 1960s and 1970s, attitudes shifted. Scientists began formally tracking Tahoe's famous clarity in 1968. And the basin became one of the most closely monitored environments in the country, precisely because its transparency makes every change visible. But that attention focused on the water itself, its clarity, its chemistry, its temperature. The bottom was another story entirely. Nobody was systematically checking what decades of human carelessness had left on the lakebed, because for most of that time, nobody could. The tools did not exist, the funding did not exist, and the Assumption was simple: out of sight, out of mind. And all the while, out past Rubicon Point, the deep water went right on, holding what it had been given. That assumption held for 70 years, until a group of scuba divers decided to test it, 1 mile at a time. Before we go under with them, if stories like this one grab you, the kind where the bottom of a lake has quietly held on to history longer than most of us have been alive, take 1 second and subscribe. This channel digs into the places and events the brochures skip, and what comes later in this story is the reason you clicked. 72 miles. In May of 2021, a Tahoe nonprofit called Clean Up the Lake launched something no one had ever attempted here: a full underwater circumnavigation of the lake. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Scuba divers would work their way around the entire 72-mile shoreline, section by section, hauling out every piece of submerged litter they could safely carry. It took them a full year, 81 dive days, 189 separate cleanup dives, more than 100 trained volunteers contributing thousands of hours, working through winter weather, wildfire smoke, and a global pandemic. When they finished in May of 2022, the final tally was staggering. Nearly 25,000 individual pieces of litter, weighing more than 25,000 pounds, pulled from the shallows of the clearest lake in America. And the inventory read like a time capsule of everything the boom years left behind. 170 tires, weighing more than 1.5 tons combined. Thousands of glass bottles and aluminum cans, engine blocks, massive pieces of broken down boats, entire lampposts, lost wallets, cordless home telephones, a Nikon film camera from the 1980s, a BlackBerry, engagement rings. Even in a twist that feels almost scripted, sunken signs warning people not to litter. Notice what that list is really telling you. The divers were working the shallow band near shore, the zone ordinary people can actually reach. If decades of casual disposal left more than 12 tons of debris where anyone with a mask could see it, the obvious question is what the deeper water is holding in the zones where no casual diver has ever been. The organization has since returned to target deeper litter hotspots, expanded its work to neighboring lakes like Donner and Fallen Leaf, and partnered with scientific institutions studying the recovered material to understand its long-term impact on the water. Divers described how personal the work started to feel, hauling out objects that last touched human hands before they were born. But the shallow cleanup had already proved a point that reshapes how you see every photograph of Tahoe. Everything those divers reached was only the top shelf, because past their depth limit, the slope keeps falling, and whatever it carried down with it is still there, waiting. The sunken fleet. Not everything on the bottom got there through carelessness, and not everything down there is trash. Some of it is history, held in place by the same cold that holds everything else. In Emerald Bay, on Tahoe's southwest shore, the state of California has turned that preservation into something you can actually visit. The Emerald Bay Maritime Heritage Trail is an underwater trail, a series of marked dive sites showcasing sunken vessels and barges resting on the bay floor. Some of the barges date back to the early 20th century, workhorses from the era when grand resorts operated on the bay and moved their supplies by water. Recreational boats from Tahoe's early tourism days rest nearby, sitting out on the sand where anyone with a tank and a flashlight can still visit them. In most lakes, wooden vessels from that era would be long gone, collapsed into shapeless debris. In Tahoe, divers can drop down onto them and see structure, form, and detail more than a century after they were built. The cold water that makes swimmers gasp at the surface is the same cold water that acts as a preservative below it, holding these wrecks in slow motion. Park officials mapped the sites, marked them for divers, and turned the bay into an underwater museum, one of the first of its kind in the country. It is a genuinely wonderful thing, but the trail also demonstrated something quietly unsettling. It proved, publicly and officially, just how well this lake preserves whatever sinks into it. Wood, metal, paint, structure. Decades pass, and the deep water barely touches them. And in the summer of 2011, the world found out that the preservation does not stop at boats. The diver returns. On July 10, 1994, a 44-year-old city planner from Reno named Donald Christopher Windecker went scuba diving off Lake Tahoe's west shore with a friend. The plan was a routine dive to around 100 feet. Somewhere during the ascent, something went wrong. His partner later reported that Windecker appeared to have trouble with his equipment and began to sink. The friend tried to help, but running dangerously low on air himself, he was forced back to the surface. Windecker never followed him up. Search efforts found nothing. In a lake this deep, with walls this steep, a body that slips past the reach of rescue divers is simply gone. Recreational scuba limits end around 130 feet. Below that, the slope keeps falling away into blackness for another 1,500 feet. And in 1994, there was no practical way to search it. The case went cold, and for 17 years, the lake kept its silence while boats crossed back and forth above the answer. Then, in late July of 2011, came the moment everything in this story had been building toward. A recreational diver was finning slowly along that sunken boat near Rubicon Point, one gloved hand steadying himself against the cold hull when he looked past the wreck into the deep water beyond it. He hung there, frozen mid-breath, while his mind ran through every innocent explanation and rejected them. Because what he was looking at was a figure, in scuba gear, resting on the slope far below, lodged at a depth of 265 feet. He surfaced with his heart pounding and reported it. The El Dorado County Sheriff's Office responded with a remotely operated vehicle, a small submersible carrying lights, a camera, and a mechanical claw, and began combing the pitch-black water. It took most of a day to relocate the figure and bring it carefully back to the surface. What came up shocked everyone involved, from the deputies on the boat to the coroner waiting on shore. It was Windecker, still in his wetsuit, still buckled into his weight belt and air tank, exactly as he had been on the morning he disappeared. And after 17 years at the bottom of Lake Tahoe, his body was so well preserved that investigators could conduct a complete autopsy. Officials attributed the extraordinary condition of the remains to the water at that depth, around 35 degrees, combined with the crushing pressure. Final identification came through dental records. Think about that timeline for a second. A man vanishes in 1994, back when almost nobody owned a cell phone. 17 years of storms, seasons, and boat traffic pass overhead. Children born that summer grow up and graduate high school. And when the lake finally returns him, he is recognizable, intact, and still able to tell investigators, through the silent evidence of his own equipment, part of the story of what went wrong on that dive. Almost nowhere else on Earth does open water do this to a human body. In Tahoe, it is simply what the deep does. The recovery made national news, and it did something else too. It took a legend that locals had been repeating for over a century and handed it a disturbing amount of credibility. Cold water, legends. Long before 2011, people around Tahoe told stories about what the deep water holds. The lake sits on the ancestral homeland of the Washoe people, whose old stories treated the water with reverence and caution. Later generations layered folklore of their own on top. Tessie, the serpent said to cruise the depths. The claim that the lake never gives up its dead. The whispered inventory of who might be resting down there. Laborers from the railroad era of the 1860s. And, from the casino decades, victims of organized crime. The mob-era part of the legend has real historical roots, at least on land. Organized crime genuinely operated around the Tahoe and Reno casino corridor in the mid-20th century, when the gaming industry was young and loosely policed, and that period produced true stories of violence and disappearance. It is not irrational that locals connected those dots to the deepest, coldest water in the region and wondered what a lake like this might have been asked to hide. And then there is the most famous Tahoe story of all, the one claiming that Jacques Cousteau dove the lake and surfaced pale, saying the world was not ready for what he had seen. This is where honesty matters, so let me be straight with you. There is no record that Cousteau ever dove Lake Tahoe at all. Researchers and journalists have looked, and the story appears to be pure folklore, a legend too good to die. The same goes for the supposed graveyard of preserved mob victims drifting in the depths. No such discovery has ever been documented by anyone, in any era. Scientists also point out that the lake is not as lifeless as the legend needs it to be. An estimated 220 million crayfish roam the bottom, which complicates the fantasy of anything resting down there untouched forever. So, the legend in its dramatic form remains unproven, but the Windecker case revealed exactly why the legend never dies. The core claim that Tahoe's cold can hold a human being in suspended time for decades stopped being a campfire story in 2011. It became a documented fact, carried in wire reports and confirmed by a county sheriff's office. The lake really can do the thing the old stories said it could. What remains unknown is how many times it has. What remains below? That question is no longer purely rhetorical, because the technology needed to ask it seriously has finally arrived. In 2020, a 29-year-old visitor named Ryan Normoyle drowned after going into the water from his rented boat, and search teams eventually located him at a depth of roughly 1,500 feet near the deepest reaches of the lake. Recovering him from that depth was described as unprecedented, a painstaking multi-agency effort using specialized equipment at pressures no human diver could survive. The following year, teams recovered another drowning victim from more than 1,000 feet down. Depths that stood as absolute barriers for all of human history are now, slowly and expensively, within reach. Meanwhile, sonar mapping keeps improving, and drought cycles periodically pull the shoreline back, exposing tires, bottles, and unidentifiable corroded metal that had sat underwater for decades. Every few years, between the machines reaching down and the water pulling back, the lake shows a little more of what it has been holding on to, and every reveal so far has pointed in the same direction. There is more down there than anyone officially counted. So here's the honest picture of where things stand today. The vast majority of Tahoe's deep basin has never been visited by anyone, human or machine. The shallow band has been combed by volunteers who hauled out more than 12 tons of our own debris. The middle depths hold preserved boats, barges, and vehicles from a vanished era. And the deep water has already, verifiably, held onto a human being for 17 years and returned him nearly untouched. What else rests at the bottom of the second deepest lake in America, after a century and a half of railroads, resorts, casinos, booms, and busts, is a question nobody alive can currently answer. The tourists will keep coming, and they should. Lake Tahoe is still every bit as beautiful as the photographs promise. The water really is that clear. The surface really does sparkle like that. But every one of those photographs stops at the surface, and now you know what the surface is capable of hiding. Not monsters, not conspiracies. Something stranger and more real. A natural cold storage system, a third of a mile deep, quietly keeping nearly everything we have ever given it, and returning pieces only when it chooses. The clearest water in America, the lake you thought you knew from 1,000 photographs, turns out to be the hardest water to truly see into. And that is not a contradiction. That is the whole story. So now I want to hear from you. If you were leading the next deep survey of Lake Tahoe with a submersible rated for the very bottom, where would you send it first? The old casino shorelines, the steep drop past Rubicon Point, or the untouched center of the basin? Drop your answer in the comments because I read every single one. And if this story pulled you in, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next video digs into another body of water that spent decades keeping a secret of its own, and what searchers finally brought up from it. The surface never tells you everything. See you in the next one.